order to pay for social care. The government promised to change that, and of course that's good. Anybody would welcome that being changed. But it's nothing compared to the cuts that Labour are proposing. I mean, what was Darling's reaction to the Tories' announcement on freezing public sector pay? It wasn't to say that's terrible, it was to announce their own public sector pay freeze. And in reality, there has been almost, in real terms, a public sector pay freeze for the majority of public sector workers for the last 5 years under this Labour government. New Labour are just as enthralled to the market as the other establishment parties, and therefore they do its bidding. This question of the size of the public debt, if you read the serious capitalist newspapers, like the Financial Times, when they're talking to each other instead of to us, they occasionally admit that perhaps the size of the public debt is not such a big problem as they're making out. So, for example, there was an article by Samuel Britton in the Financial Times last week, where he said, basically, which is true, that while the annual budget deficit is very high, the total public debt at 65% of GDP is still well below the US and Japan, is only slightly above France and Germany, and he went on to say, if the economy starts to grow again, this scale of public debt won't be serious. And then he gave very over-optimistic figures about how he thought the economy was going to start to grow again. But he also said, if it doesn't, it will be a disaster to try and cut it, because it will make the recession worse. Now that can be the commentary that they have between each other when they're discussing seriously, but the majority of British capitalism have decided that they can't afford this debt, and they are going to use it as a tool to further drive down the living conditions of working class people. And of course the IMF join in. So the IMF have written a report saying, why don't you get rid of the National Health Service while you're about it, because that costs a lot of money and that would bring down public spending. And that's always been the position of the IMF. It's the position of the Tories. The reason no government has been able to do it is because of the popular support that exists for the National Health Service. Now they raise, the capitalist politicians, the fear that there could be, that the markets basically will decide that Britain's debt is not good anymore, that it could be downgraded, that you could have a run on the pound, that you could have the IMF brought in the way that it took place in the 70s. And all of those things are possible. They could happen on the basis of capitalism. If you accept the constraints of capitalism, the market will attempt to judge you if they don't drive down public spending. So because they accept capitalism, then they also accept the propaganda of the capitalists that it's necessary to try and drive down public spending. Now, because they're so utterly tied to capitalism, in a sense, New Labour have destroyed themselves. Their dedication to it has destroyed them. After all, only a couple of weeks before the collapse of Lehman Brothers, Gordon Brown was still lecturing the governments of France and Germany that their cities, their finance sectors, were not deregulated enough, that more deregulation was needed. Britain was a hedge fund extraordinaire. Finance capitalism ran riot, and New Labour backed it to the hilt. When it imploded, New Labour stepped in, but in order to rescue capitalism. In this week's Socialist, the weekly paper of the Socialist Party, there's a quote from William Keegan in The Observer, and he asked the question, was it New Labour's historical role to save capitalism and collapse in the process? Well, it's looking a bit that way, isn't it, at the moment? I'm not saying they necessarily will collapse completely, but they're certainly heading, as things stand, towards an election defeat, not because the Tories are popular. In fact, the majority still may not be as big as the Tories think it's going to be, as the opinion polls look like at the moment, as workers, particularly those who can remember what the Tories were like, start to realise the reality of the brutal cuts that will come under the Tories. There may be a layer who, holding their noses, go back and vote Labour because they think the cuts won't be quite as bad. So the Tories may not win with the majority they're expecting to. But however they win, if they win, it will not be because they're popular, but because New Labour is so hated as a result of the policies that it's carrying out. But of course, if the Tories are elected, they will carry out the same policies with knobs on that have made New Labour unpopular. So what's the alternative? We don't accept the logic of the market. And the first thing that we would say is we have to build a mass movement against these cuts. We in the last century, in the 20th century, when there have been absolute cuts in the size of the public sector as opposed to a slowing of the growth. One was at the end of the Second World War, very briefly, but the other was in the 1920s, and one of the results of it was the 1926 general strike. It was one of the factors that led to the British working class carrying out the only general strike that is carried out to date. And we need to make sure that a movement is mobilised against the cuts that are coming. It's not automatic that they will be carried through. It's true at the moment, there will be quite a lot of people, particularly those who don't work in the public sector, who would say, well, there's no choice. We have to carry through cuts. Because all the newspapers are telling them that. All the politicians are telling them that. That's one thing. It's not what they're going to say when it's their school, their hospital, their local community centre that is threatened with closure. That will be very different. Those members of the Socialist Party that were around in the 70s, which is before my time, say that initially there was support from the majority of the population in opinion polls for the incomes policies that were implemented at that point in time, or that they tried to implement. But in the end, the Labour government was brought down over them. When people were actually faced with the reality, it was a very different situation. So we need to help to mobilise a movement involving different sections of the population. A movement of young people, which Matt is going to go on to talk about, is very important. The National Union of Students, which are meant to organise young students to fight back, have completely vacated the fields. They're doing nothing. At the same time, as young people face mass unemployment, they face in the universities huge overcrowding. The stories in the press about them building bunk beds in student halls so they can fit 2 students into those tiny little rooms and charge them through the nose for them because of the overcrowding that exists in the universities, the cuts that are taking place, the threat of the raising of the cap on tuition fees. All of those things mean there's a possibility of a movement of students, but also of young people that are facing unemployment. And that's why Youth Fight for Jobs are organising this demonstration on the 28th of November, which Matt can say a little bit more about. I'd only say one thing on it. I think a lot of young people will say, well, I'll come on the demo, it's good you're doing it, but it won't make any difference. You can't stop the cuts. But that just isn't true. You can't always stop them, but if you don't fight, you definitely won't stop them. And sometimes you can. I first got involved in the Socialist Party and its predecessor, the Militants, as a school student.